All television and radio stations in the United States will now cease their regular programming.
On page 40 of the book War or Peace by John Foster Dulles, published in 1950, he wrote that the United Nations represents not a final stage in the development of world order, but only a primitive stage, and you'll find that same thing nearly 50 years later on the last page of the Grand Chessboard. The plan is to eventually upgrade the existing UN structures, not the UN, but the existing UN structures. In other words, to replace the United Nations with the so-called New World Order, which is the first beast of Revelation 13, the one world political system that doesn't come into being until the woe of the fifth trumpet. Many people mistakenly believe we're already in the so-called New World Order, and that's part of the curse that comes from not diligently hearkening to God's voice, as you can see in Deuteronomy chapter 28. If you fail to carefully study God's word chapter by chapter and verse by verse, you'll fail to understand the chronological order of events as well as that which is symbolic as opposed to that which is literal in the book of Revelation. Trillions of locusts descend on East Africa, and second wave, says this Washington Post article, and you'll find locusts mentioned in the curse in Deuteronomy 28 also, but really the curse from not hearkening diligently to the voice of the Lord our God is, among many other things, to not understand that the locusts in Revelation chapter 9 as well as the book of Joel aren't literal but are symbolic of Satan's fallen angels that won't even be on earth until the 5-month-long hour of temptation begins at the woe of the fifth trumpet. On March 7th, the Virginia Pilot put out an article called African Locust Swarms Are Man-Made Tragedy, and in the article you'll find out these locusts are being whistled and shouted at and having blankets and sticks waved at them as opposed to being doused with massive amounts of insecticide. So it's almost as though the people that call the shots want a biblical-looking plague of locusts, but again, the locusts in Revelation chapter 9 as well as the book of Joel aren't literally locusts, and the first 4 vials in Revelation 16 that have been poured out so far aren't literal plagues either, but rather plagues of deception poured out from 1830 to 1948 when the 4 hidden dynasties were globalized, the first 4 vials being the same thing as the first 4 trumpets and the first 4 seals, which are the 4 horsemen of Revelation chapter 6. And literal famine that's being caused by the literal locusts in Africa isn't the famine of the 3rd seal, which lines up with the 2nd trumpet and the 2nd vial in the hidden dynasty of economics, because the famine of the end times is a famine for hearing the word of the Lord. Not hearing God's truth with understanding is what brings about the curse of Deuteronomy 28, which again includes not understanding that the locusts in the first 6 plagues of Revelation 16 aren't literal, and that would include thinking the current pandemic is biblical as well, when if anything it's another case of the robbers of thy people exalting themselves to establish the vision, as it's written in Daniel 11:14. But they shall fail, because it won't happen until Satan and his angels are cast from heaven to earth. The pandemic has furthered the breaking of the great horn of the he-goat with the defunding of the World Health Organization, which is part of the United Nations, and it's pretty much reset Bretton Woods to the point that American primacy will go unchallenged. And economics and politics are 2 of the first 6 plagues written of in Revelation 16. The 2nd and 3rd vials that were poured out in 1913 and 1945, nation rising against nation in Luke 21, meaning the Kenite nation rising against the Kenite nation to break its own horn, the great horn of the he-goat in Daniel chapter 8, which is the United Nations in my opinion. And then, after the great horn of the he-goat is broken, the one world political system emerges when Satan and his angels are cast from heaven to earth. Satan's angels being the so-called locusts in Revelation chapter 9 as well as the book of Joel, and the Gnar, Swarmer, and Devourer stages in the first 2.5 months, the fearful sights of Luke 21 possibly, then the deadly wound, which is kingdom against kingdom, and then Satan appears as Antichrist at 666, performing the signs and lying wonders written of in Revelation 13 and 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, the great signs as Christ calls them in Luke 21, the same Greek word as wonders in Revelation 13:13, 666 being when all 6 plagues of deception kill spiritually, not physically but spiritually, when the first 6 trumpets of Revelation chapters 8 through 11 are all sounding at the same time. It's also when the seals go into their ultimate spiritual meaning as well, but it's it's not until immediately after the half hour, which is the final 2.5 months written of in the seventh seal, which is also the seventh trumpet and the seventh vial, that the true Christ returns as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, when all are changed into spiritual bodies, as it's written in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And as Christ says in Luke chapter 21 verse 8, "Take heed that ye be not deceived, for many shall come in his name, saying they're Christ," or a Christian sent by Christ, when they're really deceived by the hidden dynasty of religion. And what does Christ warn us they'll be trying to deceive us about? He says right here, they'll be saying the time draweth near. Go ye not therefore after them. They'll be trying to deceive you about the chronological order of events as laid out in the book of Revelation, so you'll be deceived when the false Christ appears at 666, Satan in his role of Antichrist. So again, rightly divide the word of truth and put forth the work it takes to understand where we are in the prophetic timeline according to our Father's word, studying to show yourself approved, whereby you're not deceived. As it's written in Jeremiah 17 verse 5, "Cursed be the man that trusteth in man," or woman, there's no gender here, "and maketh flesh his arm, and whose heart departeth from the Lord. Hearken diligently to the voice of the Lord our God, and be blessed," as it's written in Deuteronomy chapter 28.